Hey guys, tonight we're unraveling a dark little secret from history. Why medieval women, actually asterisk, dreaded their wedding nights more than a trip to the dentist or a binge watch of reality TV. Spoiler, it wasn't just about love or romance. It was a terrifying gamble with their bodies, their sanity, and often their lives. So, before we dive into centuries of dirt, dew, and dubious hygiene, smash that like button if you're into stories that make you thankful for the 21st century. And maybe leave a comment with your own "thank God I wasn't born then" moment. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's step into a world where marriage meant survival, and the phrase "happily ever after" was more horror story than fairy tale. In a quiet 13th century village, Eleanor stood beside her family after the solemn church ceremony, her hands nervously clasped where her wedding veil fell softly over her shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of wax candles and baked bread, and villagers whispered softly about the new alliance struck that day. The vows had been simple, spoken with steady voices, but beneath the calm surface, a certain weight settled, an invisible thread linking Eleanor to her future husband, Lord Rowan. She caught the faint glance of her mother, whose smile was tight and fleeting, hinting at unspoken worries. Somewhere in her mind, she registered the strict customs, the expectation that her life now rotated around producing an heir, a silent obligation cloaked in tradition and quiet duty. That night, as lanterns dimmed and the silence deepened, Eleanor's thoughts drifted into the unfamiliar space of anticipation and apprehension. She had heard whispers from older women, warnings about the wedding night, about the shadows and uncertainty that lurked behind the closed door. The room was cold, save for the faint warmth of the hearth, which cast long flickering shadows on the stone walls. The bed was made of rough linen, uninviting in its simplicity, yet destined to be the scene of their union. Eleanor's fingers traced the embroidery on her sleeve, her breath slow, her heart a quiet drum. The moment seemed to stretch endlessly, heavy with expectation, yet oddly suspended in a calm that only sleep could gently invade. Irony lingered like a whisper, as the villagers' warnings painted the wedding night as something to fear, an unknown that might swallow a girl whole. Yet often the night was, in its quiet way, disappointingly mundane. Lord Rowan's deliberate gestures, the faint scent of oil on his skin, and the slow, awkward motions of their first shared moments reminded Eleanor sharply of a domestic scene, mundane and human, not nightmarish or mysterious. The bed creaked under their hesitant movements, and the silence between them grew thick with unspoken hope and resignation. Sometimes humor crept in quietly, how stories had exaggerated the fear, how the grand event might be simply two tired bodies passing time In a room that was more cold than ominous, Elinor realized that the dread was harder to hold onto once faced with the soft reality of it all. As dawn approached, Elinor found herself staring at the faint light filtering through a narrow window. Her usual restless mind oddly soothed by the stillness of the morning. The room was peaceful now. The worst fears dissolved into shadows of imagination, slipping away with the night. Lord Rowan, still asleep, looked less formidable in slumber, his face relaxed and unremarkable. Outside, the village stirred. An old woman hobbled past, humming softly, unaware of Elinor's quiet reflection. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that the wedding night was just a small human event, a quiet beginning rather than a dramatic confrontation. There was no need for grand fears. Life's small, imperfect moments often carried the most honest truths. Looking back, Elinor saw her wedding night not as a story of terror, but as a brief chapter in the slow, ongoing story of human imperfection. The fears had faded like the last embers of the fire, leaving only a soft memory of uncertainty and quiet acceptance. She discovered that even in the smallest, most routine moments, there was a strange beauty, an ordinary human rhythm that carried on without much fuss. The customs that once seemed so strict now felt like a gentle framework for a life filled with small misunderstandings and simple human hopes. Perhaps, she mused quietly, the true story of such nights was less about fear and more about patience with oneself, with others, and with the steady passage of time. On the evening of the wedding feast, the great hall was filled with the soft hum of laughter, the clinking of pewter cups, and the low strumming of a lute. Guests lingered in warm robes, their faces relaxed, yet eyes flickered nervously toward the bride, Elinor, who sat quietly amid the revelry. Her mother, Matilda, watched with calm patience, her expression faintly wistful as she discreetly handed Elinor a small parchment inscribed with legal clauses, reminders of the vows that tethered Elinor to her new household. The air smelled of roasted meat and spiced wine, but beneath the surface, a gentle tension lingered like the quiet before a storm. Here, amid the ordinary sounds of a festive night, the quiet process of binding young women to their roles was quietly begun. As the evening wore on, the music softened into a distant murmur, and later, the wooden benches grew quieter with age and space. Elinor felt a strange emptiness creeping alongside her lingering smiles. She secretly wondered about the days ahead, about the small moments of independence slipping away like sand through fingers. Her mother's eyes remained fixed on her, subtly reminding her, through a faint squeeze of her hand, that her legal and religious vows would shortly bind her not just to her husband, to a life of constant service within his household. Shadows from flickering torches danced on the stone walls, morphing her dreams into shadows of obligation. And she held her breath, knowing the next chapter was already shaping up to be a test of her silent resolve. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the hall, some whispered irony surfaced. The celebration's joy had been carefully crafted to mask the quiet anxiety about what came after, about the loss of personal agency, the fragile promise of chastity under the scrutiny of witnesses and sacred vows. Aliner's gaze drifted past the guards and guardians to the blurred, unseen faces, prophets and saints whose features were hidden by the darkness or behind a haze of light. The promises made tonight, so carefully cloaked in tradition, hinted at far more than love. They hinted at a future where a woman's truth could be judged by the faintest discrepancy, the smallest doubt, and all the while, the revelers carried on, blissfully unaware of the quiet irony embedded in their joy. Eventually, the hall grew still, the fire flickered low, and Aliner found herself in a rare moment of quiet contemplation. The bustling sounds of the feast had faded into a gentle hum in her mind, and she remembered her mother's quiet reminders, not with fear, but with a strange calmness. The evening's superficial merriment contrasted starkly with the quiet certainty of her new responsibilities ahead. She settled into her chair, noticing the gentle warmth of the room, feeling the soft fabric of her gown against her skin, and wondered how many other women felt the same quiet resignation, even as they smiled. In this calm, there was a strange kind of honesty, an acknowledgement that some promises were made in silence, with no certainty of happiness, only the hope that time would somehow soften the weight. Years later, looking back from a distance of quiet years, Aliner might have thought that the wedding feast was like many other quietly endured ceremonies, an ordinary moment tinged with universal human imperfections. The celebration was just a fleeting scene on the long canvas of life, marked by a gentle humor that history rarely whispered loudly. How humans, regardless of era, often celebrate beginnings, while secretly bracing for the uncertain days ahead. The vows, the clauses, the unspoken expectations, they all quietly slipped into the fabric of everyday life. And so, beneath the silent witnesses and blurred figures of prophets, women like Aliner found their own small, steady ways to navigate the quiet absurdity of the love and duty that defined their nights. In the quiet hours after the wedding feast had dwindled and the candles flickered low, Aliner found herself seated beside her new husband, their hands resting awkwardly on a shared fleece. The room was scented of damp wool and candle wax, a small space between two lives beginning with a mingling of hope and resignation. Though the vows had been spoken and the ceremony concluded, there was a subtle weight in the air, an unspoken expectation woven into the fabric of their union, one that neither dared to name aloud. As shadows lengthened, Aliner's mind drifted, yet beneath her calm exterior, a silent flicker of unease stirred. Here, amid the hum of distant voices and the soft ticking of a nearby clock, a quiet understanding formed. Marriage was both promise and currency, held together by unseen rules. It was a beginning, yet also a quiet acknowledgement of the uncertain journey ahead. As dawn seeped slowly through narrow windows, Aliner awoke with a muted sense of obligation. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her gown, already aware that the night's ceremonies had not merely sealed love, but had woven her into a contractual web. The hidden clause in her marriage contract flickered at the back of her mind, an unspoken condition that the morning's act must not only fulfill physical union, but also serve as a test of her obedience and worth. The thought hung in the cool air, alien yet familiar, as her eyes traced the embroidery on her shift. Every movement she made felt deliberate, weighed down by the unspoken price if she faltered. Though the room seemed still, Aliner sensed the invisible strings tying her future to this delicate, uncharted burden. Later, as the maid drew back the heavy curtains and sunlight spilled into the chamber, Aliner caught herself smiling faintly at her own irony. Just beyond her line of sight, the marriage contract lay folded, an unassuming parchment that carried the power to determine her fortune, her inheritance, her standing, perhaps even her reputation within the small community. The morning's act was no longer simply about love. It was a transaction, an arbitration of worth between her and her husband, mediated by unseen expectations and silent judgments. She wondered quietly if her beauty or her silence mattered more. The quiet absurdity that her worth could hinge on a single, unspoken moment was both cruel and oddly mundane. Somewhere within these quiet hours, Aliner acknowledged that her dread was a shared mirror of countless women's hidden fears, an invisible bargain they all carried. As afternoon shadows lengthened into a gentle haze, Aliner settled into a chair with a woven cloth in her hands, her thoughts drifting in slow circles. She observed the small, familiar patterns, her own fingers tracing the edges of the fabric, the ticking clock on the wall, the distant, muffled voices of others going about their day. There was no grand spectacle anymore, only the slow, quiet realization that her future was subtly steered by the unspoken rules of the morning's deed. She found a strange, ironic comfort in the sameness, knowing that many women before her had likely faced this same silent interrogation. The weight she carried was not heavy in terms of stones or chains, but in the quiet expectation that her worth was measured through a single, invisible act. And so, in the calm between moments, she let her mind drift, accepting the quiet ironies of her human condition. As evening drew near and the house settled into a gentle lull, Alina looked once more at the faded parchment of her marriage contract, now resting quietly on a nearby table. She thought of all the unseen bargains women had silently made across generations, exchanging dignity for security, hope for obligation. Her own room seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different in that slow, contemplative silence. The absurdity was clear. A single night, a single act, could shadow her entire life. And yet, in the stillness, she found a strange, enduring truth. Human life persisted in gentle moments, quietly resilient in its ordinary struggles and subtle ironies. With a deep, calming breath, she acknowledged her part within this ancient, unseen web, accepting that some bargains, silent and unseen, were the quiet fabric of shared human history. In the quiet light of evening, Alina sat by the rough wooden bench, her hands softly clasped as the hall slowly filled with whispers of preparations. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of herbs and the distant murmur of household chores. As her eyes met the blurred, unseeing faces of her family, she sensed the weight of the moment without quite understanding its full gravity. Yet, somehow knowing she would soon cross into an unfamiliar silence. The candle flickered, casting shadows that danced sluggishly on the stone walls, echoing her slow, tentative heartbeat. It was ordinary, yet the quiet anticipation cloaked her in a gentle, unspoken tension, as if history itself was holding its breath. When night fell, Alina found herself in the dim chamber, the flickering candle casting a weak glow over the bed, draped in coarse linen. A midwife, her face as obscured as a blurred portrait, quietly prepared parchment to record the event. Her fingers steady despite the gravity of her task. Lord Rowan's demands were spoken softly, almost as an afterthought, while Alina's breath grew shallow and deliberate. Outside, the household's watchful eyes seemed to linger just beyond the door, ears tuned for any movement or sound that might suggest defiance or distress. Tension thickened as Alina hesitated, caught between compliance and the fragile hope of quiet resistance, knowing that her choices carried uncertain consequences. A strange irony settled in the chamber. Here was life's most intimate act recorded with clinical detachment, while outside, the household waited silently for news. Alina's gaze was fixed on the stone wall, her nerves taut as a bowstring, her mind flickering between obedience and rebellion. The midwife's hand moved purposefully, her pen gliding across parchment, as if physical details were merely data in an unchanging system. The room's sluggish stillness was punctuated only by the faint rustle of cloth and the soft, almost humorous, flickering of the candle's flame. Beneath the surface, Alina wondered silently whether history would remember her as obedient or quietly brave, perhaps both, in a way that somehow seemed faintly absurd. As the night deepened, a calm, almost surreal, quiet settled over Alina's mind. The room's stillness became a moment of gentle acceptance, a pause where external chaos faded into the background of her thoughts. The household's watchfulness persisted only as a distant hum, a reminder that the world outside remained unchanged, with its quiet routines and small daily motions. Alina's breathing slowed, her fears diffusing into the cool air, and she allowed herself a fleeting sense of impermanence. This moment would soon pass, like all others. Outside, dawn's faint promise tiptoed through the small window, offering a soft return to normalcy, if only for a day or two before everything was recorded, remembered, or forgotten. Later, lying quietly in the aftermath of the ordeal, Alina reflected on the strange, unspoken rituals of her time. How life's most profound moments bustle behind the scenes of routine, slipping between duty and quiet resistance. Her body still bore the subtle tension of that night, while her mind drifted around the edges of what had truly been at stake, and whether her silent, understated defiance might have been more than just survival. Around her, the household moved on, mundane as ever, the stories settling into their quiet place within history's slow, indifferent weave. She understood then that these nights, filled with silent negotiations and hidden fears, were as normal as the dawn that would come again, sleepy and familiar, with all its small human imperfections. As dawn's pale light seeped through the small window of Alina's chamber, she quietly prepared herself for what was soon to come, her breath slow and deliberate. The air was cool. The heavy wooden bed creaked softly beneath her, and her eyes lingered on the worn tapestry hanging nearby, the only witness to countless nights of silent dread. Her fingers trembled slightly as she staged the small act of feigning assent, a weak shield in a world where her voice often went unheard. Somewhere beyond the door, voices stirred, but she remained perfectly still, saving her breath for the quiet act of survival. The morning felt both distant and inevitable, wrapped in a delicate tension that contrasted sharply with the stillness of her body. As the sun's rays expanded, casting a warm but indifferent glow over the chamber, the tension in the room thickened. Alina's heart beat quietly against her ribs, hoping her facade would hold. The man beside her, unaware of her internal struggle, shifted and muttered something unremarkable, as if the ritual of the night was just another step he expected. Marred by old customs, the moment carried a strange sense of routine, where innocence and fear intertwined beneath a veneer of consent. Though neither was truly authentic, a passing glance from the window revealed a monk walking past, his shadow flickering across the floor, perhaps sensing the unspoken, a whisper of compassion in a space that often lacked it. Yet Alina dared not speak, knowing that silence was her only shield in this fragile, whispered battle. A gentle irony lingered in the air as the old traditions persisted, masked by social customs that made such nights seem inevitable, even ordained. The monk's presence here, quietly watching, highlighted how little protection the canonical laws truly offered to women, promising salvation while often rendering them voiceless. Alina's mind orbited around the small cracks in the system, spaces where understanding and mercy might seep through if one looked closely enough. The routine made the night feel like an endless, slow-motion dance of discomfort, punctuated only by the distant sounds of villagers settling into their routines. A faint half-smile touched Alina's lips, a bitter irony that her submission was sometimes mistaken for humble strength. And yet, in her quiet, lived the slow awakening that perhaps change could dawn even in the darkest hours. Slowly, as the sun climbed further and the household stirred into the daily rhythm, Alina's breathing grew steadier, and a modest sense of calm crept in. She disentangled herself, not with boldness, but with a subtle act of self-preservation, softly asserting her own small space within the vast, indifferent world. The monk, now out of sight, left behind a faint memory of empathy, whispering a hope that one day these customs might loosen their grip. The house settled into the ordinary sounds of scraping dishes and quiet conversation, as if the night's fears had quietly dissolved into the background noise of life. Alina, once voiceless in her pain, now felt a gentle flicker of something like quiet dignity emerging from her coded resistance. Here, amidst the routine, lay the faint possibility of better understanding, not just for her, but for others who endured the same slow, unspoken struggle. Reflecting in the quiet aftermath, one might see that the story of Alina was not merely a tale of fear, but also a slow, subtle shift toward awareness and compassion. Her act of silent rebellion, faint as it was, had sparked a small, unseen ripple in the community's consciousness, challenging the harshness of customs long taken for granted. The blurred faces of prophets and saints in old paintings on the wall seemed less distant now, their unseen gaze perhaps bearing silent witness to the quiet perseverance of women like Eleanor. Somewhere in the background, the shadows of tradition still lingered, but the air had begun to shift, leaving room for questions to be asked softly, unexpectedly. From her modest act, a slow, calm recognition seeped into the fabric of daily life, reminding everyone that even in stillness, human stories quietly endure, waiting for a better dawn. In the soft light of a spring morning in 1247, Lady Eleanor of Westmark prepared for what should have been an ordinary day. Yet her marriage to Sir Rowland, a modest knight, had already been carefully woven into the fabric of land, kinship, and promise. The grand ceremony had taken hours, with voices echoing through stone halls, filled with the clink of cups and the rustle of fine linens. The marriage sealed not only their vows, but also the tangled web of legal and financial ties, silently whispering of obligations that would stretch beyond the days of celebration. The delicate dance of alliances had been performed with a measured grace, leaving behind a lingering sense that something smaller, quieter, now depended on what came next. No one seemed in a hurry, yet beneath the calm surface, a subtle tension grew, an anticipation of the inevitable test that would reveal the true stakes of their union. As evening settled in, the couple found themselves in the shadowy privacy of their chamber, where the flickering candlelight cast uncertain shapes on the stained walls. The act of bringing their bodies together, seemingly simple, still carried a faint undercurrent of complexity, an unspoken awareness of unseen legal and fiscal specters waiting in the wings. Small touches, hesitant movements, and measured breaths became loaded with quiet questions. Would their consummation uphold the vows or trigger unforeseen consequences? The room was silent save for the faint rustle of fabric and the distant clock's slow tick, each sound underscoring the fragile boundary between affection and obligation. Their union was no longer only emotional. It was a tentative step into a labyrinth of rules devised centuries ago, where even intimacy bore the weight of law and ledger. In the cool dawn light of the next day, the irony of their situation settled gently upon them. Something so natural as union was also a point of legal vulnerability. Prone to the slow rise of paperwork and accounts, the local scribes, with their ink and parchment, knew the importance of recording even the smallest detail. Was the marriage consummated? And was it done so properly? To neglect this official acknowledgement could mean disputes over land, inheritance, dowries, or social standing. The simple act of joining their bodies had unexpectedly become a potential source of conflict or loss, depending on how it was documented or misremembered. It was, perhaps, a quiet reminder that human intimacy was never truly free from the watchful eyes of law and economy. The day continued unfazed, yet beneath its gentle routine, a subtle, persistent question remained: how much of their shared life was already inscribed in legal ink? By late afternoon, Lady Elinor and Sir Rowland sat quietly in the courtyard, watchful of the slow progress of their land's chores and the distant, unhurried sounds of rural life. They had come to accept that the day's quiet rituals, shared meals, slow walks, and the faint hum of everyday labor had their own unspoken poetry, separate from the legal questions that hung in the air like a gentle fog. The morning's tension had dissolved into a shared placidity, a mundane calm that felt oddly reassuring, as if acknowledging the absurdity of human arrangements, yet finding comfort in routine. The laws and rules surrounding their union had quietly, perhaps cynically, woven themselves into the fabric of daily existence, not as a threat, but as a persistent background chorus. In that slow, unremarkable moment, they seemed to understand that life, like law, was often a series of quiet compromises, small acts of human resilience amid invisible chains. Looking back later, the story of Lady Elinor and Sir Rowland revealed a simple truth. Beneath the ordinary veneer of medieval marriage lay an intricate dance of human hopes, intertwined with legal caution. The slow and measured steps, the unspoken worries, and the faintly humorous ironies of their union stood as a testament to how fragile, complex, and quietly human these moments could be. Their story, like so many others, was not one of grand passion, but of steady, enduring restraint, a reminder that in the quiet corners of history, the mundane often carries the deepest meaning. As they drifted into sleep that night, neither quite knowing what would come next, the world outside continued its unhurried, indifferent spin, silent, and perhaps a little amused at how humans manage to woven their lives into delicate tapestries of obedience and hope. In the quiet hours of the late medieval court, a young couple finally crossed the threshold of their chamber, the flickering candle casting soft shadows on their worn tapestries. Their union, arranged and sealed by family agreement, was now considered complete, the tangible step towards social stability. Yet, amid the gentle rustling of linens and faint whisper of breath, a subtle tension lingered, an awareness that their bed had yet to yield proof of fruitful purpose. Rumors, slow and unlikely to be silenced, began to drift through the stone corridors, murmuring that perhaps the marriage remained unfulfilled in the most essential way. The day's calm felt weighted by the silent questions hanging in the air, as if history's patience was all that kept the scene from tipping into quiet chaos. As days turned into weeks, the gossip grew softer, but persisted, woven into the fabric of village life like an unfinished tapestry. The couple's inability to produce an heir started to cast shadows over their reputation, and the local clergy, always observant but often detached, considered the matter with measured solemnity. Canon law, ancient and unyielding, stipulated that failure to sire an heir could be deemed a breach of marital vow, a legal and moral failing with tangible consequences. The church's officials, with their heavy robes and unreadable faces obscured by shadow and flame, drafted a penalty, an expensive penance that threatened to drain the limited resources of Westmark's small, noble house. Thus, beneath the surface of everyday routines, a quiet struggle unfolded over gold and honor. The irony of the situation lingered quietly, tucked into the folds of daily life. How a simple act meant to affirm unity could become a matter of legal liability and financial peril. When the couple attended Mass, their eyes occasionally met with distant, unspoken understanding, as if acknowledging the absurdity of their predicament without vocalizing it. The Church's faint rules, established centuries ago, now played a leading role in shaping their future, like an unseen but persistent hand guiding their steps. The costs of their silence, the potential fines, and the possibility of a damaged reputation, all fused into a quiet comedy of human attempts at control and societal order. Even amid hardship, life continued. Meals passed in muted conversation. Children played quietly in the courtyard, unaware of the heavy stakes this silent transaction held. Eventually, a sense of calm settled as both the young couple accepted the slow drift of destiny, their shared routine becoming a gentle rhythm that neither tried too hard to change. The whispers receded into background noise, like the distant hum of a familiar, weathered tapestry. The small charges and fines, weighing heavily in the ledger, seemed to fade into the fabric of daily necessity, as if just another chapter in their quiet story. They learned to live around the uncertainty, much like a worn stone's slow erosion over countless seasons, predictable, inevitable, quietly enduring. The legal and financial risks persisted like a mild, invisible burden. But life went on, fragile and human as ever, with no grand resolutions, only soft acceptance. In the stillness that follows such turbulent moments, it is possible to see that human life is woven from such minor, enduring tensions, small acts, little worries, unspoken fears, each one quietly shaping the course of history. The blurred faces of prophets or saints in forgotten murals seem to nod subtly from the shadows, unseen witnesses to mundane yet profound truths. The story of the couple, burdened by the debt of blood, becomes just one more gentle thread in the vast, slow tapestry of human endeavor, an illustration of how even the weightiest concerns find their calm beneath the surface of everyday existence. And in that quiet, unremarkable space, perhaps there is a kind of peace, however fleeting, in merely enduring and moving softly forward, unnoticed by the wider world. In the slow, quiet hours of a medieval morning, the young couple's modest chamber lingered in a gentle hush, sunlight seeping through the small, woolen-curtained window. Their hands, rough and tentative, hovered above each other, uncertain but hopeful in the stillness. Outside, village sounds drifted in cartwheels creaking, distant hammer blows, forming a soft backdrop to the small union made with quiet pride. It was a moment of ordinary certainty, where the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first true sign of union. Little did they suspect that, beneath this calm, the first whispers of legal trouble already stirred beneath the surface of their simple day. As days passed, the peaceful veneer of their wedding began to fracture slowly, like thin ice cracking under a winter moon. A distant cousin, Lord Aldrich, appeared at court with deliberate calm, claiming that the marriage was invalid due to what he called alleged impotence, a quiet phrase loaded with a distant, old-world comedy of judgment. He claimed the dowry should be returned, eyes flickering with the faint hope of recovering lost wealth, while the court's officials, ever watchful for revenue, noted the potential gains from confiscated lands. The young couple, sitting quietly in their humble home, sensed more than understood the weight of these words, the uneven hand of history pressing quietly upon their future. Irony settled softly like dust. What once was simple was now tangled in legal shadows, and greed's quiet march, it was a delicate dance of words, as the court's clerks, wearily scribbling with quill pens, sorted through tangled claims and dusty parchment. Lord Aldrich's voice, low and deliberate, echoed through stone halls, asserting his right to challenge the marriage's validity, while the king's tax collectors pooled in the adjacent corridor, eyeing the potential lands that might soon be theirs. The young bride, her face shadowed by uncertainty, listened beneath her hair as the legal machinery churned quietly, its gears turning to the tune of coin and claim. The irony of the moment lingered, familial bonds dissolving into financial potential, each side whispering their quiet ambitions beneath a veneer of civility. Time seemed to hold its breath, caught between human error and the slow creak of old law. Later, in a room dimly lit by the flickering glow of a tallow candle, the young couple sat in contemplative silence, their hands loosely touching, as if to anchor each other against the distant storm of accusations, the courtroom disputes, the claims and counterclaims, drifted like faint echoes in the background of everyday life. A reminder that even the most personal moments could be shaped by cold legality and fiscal concerns. The faded faces of prophets and judges, they remained unseen, their features blurred behind a faded light, watched silently over these small dramas, their faces hidden from view and concern. Calm settled gently over the household as life continued in its slow, measured rhythm amid the chaos of legal claims. The ordinary and extraordinary blending into one muted story. Looking back, the young couple's experience mirrors a quiet truth about human endeavors. That beneath every layer of law and wealth, life quietly persists, marked by small, imperfect moments of resilience. The distant cousin and the tax collectors, caught in their pursuit of gains, simply added another subtle chapter to the endless history of human desire and folly. Perhaps, in some small way, the true story lies not in the grand disputes or powdered courtrooms, but in the calm patience of everyday life, those moments when, despite the chaos, another dawn quietly arrives. As time moves on and the legal dust settles, what remains are the faint echoes of ordinary lives, softly marked by human imperfection, waiting patiently in the slow, unending parade of history. In the quiet corners of a modest chamber, Sir Rowland signed the marriage contract with a flickering candle, casting long shadows on parchment. The air was thick with the unspoken hope that this union would solidify alliances and secure future wealth. Yet behind the calm facade lay a subtle tension, the unknown of what consummation might mean to the court's invisible eyes. As night fell, the couple retreated into the shadows of the bedchamber, where the night's quiet rituals took place. A hesitant touch, a glance that lingered a moment too long. Outside, the stone walls held their secrets, and the faint rustle of the linen faintly whispered stories of human imperfection. The day's hope was simple, a marriage like any other, quietly waiting for the dawn and some semblance of certainty. As dawn approached, the couple's union entered a new stage, involving witnesses, curious physicians, and the slow unfolding of courtroom judgment. The morning light filtered through small, stained glass windows, casting muted colors across the assembled figures: groomsmen, clergy, and scribes, all waiting with quiet expectancy. Witnesses took turns describing the night's events, their voices blending with the distant, muffled sounds of the castle beyond. The physicians, with their measuring eyes and dry commentary, debated whether the act had indeed been consummated, their faces blurred by shadow and the uncertain light. The room's atmosphere softened into a strange mix of relief and disappointment, like an uncertain dawn where the sky remained stubbornly clouded, waiting for clarity that might never come. Amid the slow, deliberate debate, A touch of irony emerged, not in harsh ridicule, but in the way human efforts to measure intimacy had become a tedious, almost humorous ritual. The bishop, with a face obscured by a faint glow, finally delivered a verdict. The marriage was valid and binding. Yet, in the same breath, he imposed a heavy levy, a financial burden that weighed more than any physical proof. Sir Rowland listened quietly as the numbers sank into his mind. The weight of the court's decision, both legal and financial, settling on him like a slow, persistent tide. The irony was human, marriage validated by witnesses, yet financially shackled by the court's need for expense recovery. The moment felt oddly distant, as if time itself paused between solemnity and triviality. In the weeks that followed, Sir Rowland sat at his study table, pages of account books open before him, the bill from the court lying unopened beside them. The old manor, once a symbol of pride, now seemed just a relic burdened by debt. Its walls echoed the quiet rustling of paper and distant footsteps. The court's verdict remained, and the marriage endured no grand celebrations, no fireworks, only a slow, ongoing adjustment to silent financial reality. Humble routines continued in muted acceptance. Chamber pots emptied, candles replaced, and the same everyday worries persisted. There was a strange calm in that ordinariness, an acknowledgement that human endeavors, even the most solemn, could be gently tangled in the mundane web of life's small, relentless burdens. Looking back, Sir Rowland's experience became one of many quiet stories, a reminder that human institutions often shaped personal moments with rules and taxes, layering simplicity with ironies only history could appreciate. The blurred faces of prophets and judges watched from distant shadows, their expressions unreadable in the dim light of history's slow march. Human imperfection did not suddenly vanish with words or vows, but persisted quietly in the soft creak of a chair, the rustle of parchment, or the slow turning of a new page in an aging account book. These moments, mundane and slightly absurd, form the true fabric of human life, never quite perfect, always strangely enduring, and perhaps a little bit amused at their own persistence. In the slow stillness of a late medieval morning, Lady Elinor and Sir Rowland sat across an oak table, their fingers tracing the worn edges of parchment as the weight of legal tradition lingered in the air. It was a familiar scene. Two figures attempting to piece together a future from confusing words and ink, while the distant hum of villagers, or the ticking of a nearby hourglass bore witness. The notion of a simple union had long dissolved into a web of statutes, debts, and property, an inevitable reflection of the medieval obsession with order and inheritance. As they agreed upon an initial draft, neither could ignore the faint irony. Love, after all, was rarely considered in these negotiations. Yet, they sought some semblance of stability amid the endless uncertainty that shrouded their union. A pact not just of hearts, but of wealth and legacy. With the legal battle finally eased, tensions softened, and their voices moved from hurried to measured. Lady Elinor and Sir Rowland discussed the terms prevailing in their new agreement. They peered closely at the clauses, the ink slightly fading, searching for loopholes or ambiguities that might threaten their cautious peace. A clause to secure a joint treasury was drafted, its language deliberately vague enough to allow flexibility, but firm enough to serve as a safeguard. They agreed on clear succession rules, an attempt to prevent future disputes from bubbling up like unseen cracks beneath their calm veneer. Yet, beneath the surface of their negotiation, an unspoken awareness grew. Love was now as much a legal construct as a fleeting emotion, fragile yet wrapped in the armor of law and wealth. Irony shaded their deliberation. How easily these legal shields could turn against them, or be wielded by others unfamiliar with human desire. They chuckled softly at the absurdity of safeguarding possessions against future claims, as if wealth could be kept immune through words on parchment, unaffected by the slow erosion of time or human greed. A special clause was added to protect their estates from future creditors or greedy relatives. And as they formally took these measures, the documents felt thick and heavy in their hands, like a tangible barrier to chaos. It seemed that even in the quietest moments, the medieval penchant for endless security had a humorous side, an acknowledgement that human endeavors to contain life's unpredictability often led only to more rules and restrictions. In the calm that followed, Lady Elinor and Sir Rowland regarded their new agreement not as a perfect shield, but as a tentative piece carved from ink and intention. They observed the flickering candlelight reflected softly on the parchment, the low sound of their breath mingling with the distant murmurs of the castle. The world outside their chambers remained quietly indifferent. No grand proclamations, no profound promises, only the simple act of signing and sealing, a gesture imbued with modest hope. They understood, in this tranquil moment, that their union was no longer just a matter of passion or duty, but of pragmatic preservation. The legal protections they arranged whispered assurances of stability, yet also hinted at the quiet patience required to live within the constraints of law, love, and the mortal march of time. Later, as they slowly rose from the table, their shapes casting long, gentle shadows on rough-hewn stones, it became clear that their story was less about grand emotional gestures and more about the small, deliberate steps that define human compromise. The parchment rested quietly in a wooden chest, its legal language a soft reminder of the fragile boundary between security and suffocation. Perhaps, in this unremarkable act of securing their wealth and future, they glimpsed a truth common to all human endeavors, that love and law are both fragile, easily contained, yet forever uncertain, woven together in the slow, silent fabric of everyday life. In the end, their peace, cautious and measured, was a quiet testament to the steady hope that even in a world governed by rules, humans still cling, softly and stubbornly, to the possibility of something more enduring. In a quiet corner of an ancient Mesopotamian village, midwife Ninsun prepared her space with slow, deliberate movements. The modest hearth crackled softly, casting a warm glow over woven mats and clay vessels filled with herbal salves. Around her, curious villagers lingered at a respectful distance, exchanging hushed whispers about the sacred moment to come. The air felt thick with anticipation, yet strangely calm, as if the village was holding its collective breath. It was a routine, sacred ritual, one born of generations of tradition. Yet beneath the surface lurked a fragile layer of superstition about what the first night might bring. As the noblewoman labored into the night, shadows flickered across the mud-brick walls, and the villagers' ancient fears stirred quietly. Rumors circulated about unseen forces, ancient curses, restless spirits that haunted the first night after birth. The midwife, with her steady hands and whispering prayers, seemed to sense the weight of these old stories, though her face remained a shadowed blur beneath her linen veil. The community waited in tense silence, half expecting some supernatural twist or misfortune that would confirm their fears. It was a delicate dance between faith and doubt, woven into the very fabric of their daily life. In the quiet hours, a neighboring woman chuckled softly at a story about a misfired charm or a forgotten ritual, causing a ripple of nervous laughter to drift through the room. The midwife glanced at her with a mild, bemused expression. Her face, like most faces here, was a gentle shuffle of features, neither joyful nor grim, just quietly patient. The birth process went on, ordinary in its rhythm, breaths, pushes, the faint scent of chamomile and warm linen. Yet the villagers' eyes occasionally darted to the dark doorway, as if expecting some unseen manifestation. Time, as always, moved slowly, tinged with the irony that human worries lend their own kind of strange permanence. When dawn finally crept over the horizon, the tension eased like a tide retreating from the shore. The room grew brighter and less haunted by shadows, as if the night's fears dissolved with the darkness. The new mother rested peacefully, her brow relaxed after hours of toil, while the midwife sat quietly, tending to minor wounds with a gentle touch. The villagers, now murmuring about the success of the birth, seemed to forget the old omens, their collective face softening into a quiet, familiar tolerance for life's small absurdities. The unseen fears of the night settled into gentle memory, quietly waiting to be repeated tomorrow, or perhaps forgotten. Later, as the village settled into its usual calm, Ninsun reflected on the whispers of curses and omens that had shadowed the first night for generations. She knew that beneath rituals and fears, childbirth remained a simple, fragile act, one that human beings had always approached with cautious hope and light irony. The stories, she understood, were less about curses and more about the quiet strength of community, of daily life enduring despite the weight of superstition. Sitting by the hearth, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Life was, after all, an ongoing story of ordinary miracles wrapped in mundane fears, drifting quietly through time like the spinning of a slow, ancient wheel. In the quiet mornings of an ancient city, Ninsun carefully gathered sacred herbs from her small garden, the leaves whispering under her fingertips. She carried these into the temple with a sense of cautious hope, mindful of the stories about spirits that hovered just beyond sight. The temple healers, figures with weathered faces and hesitant eyes, listened intently as she laid out her offerings on a simple stone altar, their shadows flickering in the soft light. They warned her softly that improper ritual might invite the wrath of the birthing goddess, whose cry could turn from blessing into a deadly curse, an irony not lost on anyone involved. As she hesitated, clutching her bundle of herbs, the air grew thick with the quiet weight of old fears that refused to fade away with the centuries. Tension arose when rival healers, their voices low and edged with doubt, questioned the correctness of her preparations. They challenged her methods, pointing out minor discrepancies in the herb's arrangement or the timing of the ritual, each insisting their way was safer, more potent. The room, modest and lined with simple clay jars, became a stage for quiet disputes, each side seeking approval from unseen ancestors. The potential for a misstep loomed large, a reminder that centuries of tradition carried the risk of error, a miscalculation perhaps forgotten in the rush of human desperation. The blue-gray shadows cast by flickering oil lamps stretched across the walls, highlighting trembling hands and furrowed brows, while outside, the city's distant hum persisted undisturbed. Amidst the heated debates, a blush of irony emerged. The sacred herbs that once promised protection now seemed fragile, easily displaced by exchanging cautious glances and hesitant words. The healers, intent on safeguarding both mother and child, relied on rituals that appeared simple, but carried the weight of centuries worth of hope and dread. A gentle laugh escaped from a younger healer, who, noting the seriousness with which everyone approached the matter, commented softly that perhaps the gods themselves had a sense of humor, if only to keep their followers humble. The air grew a little lighter, a shared recognition that human efforts, no matter how meticulous, are often mingled with quiet imperfections. Outside, the distant sounds of daily life continued, unchanged and unjudging. Eventually, the tension eased as the ritual proceeded. A slow, deliberate dance of fingers touching herbs and whispered words. Ninsun's hands moved with quiet determination, her posture calm despite the lingering doubts. The heaters hummed softly, and the faint scent of dried leaves filled the cool air, mingling with the quiet patience everyone shared. The skeptics fell silent, watching as tradition moved forward, even if imperfectly executed. In that moment, the bustle of human uncertainty was touched by an undeniable stillness, a brief pause before the inevitable tide of life surged onward. The shadows, now softer, settled into places where human frailty briefly softened the edge of fear. As darkness settled outside, the temple grew quiet again, and Ninsun reflected on the small, imperfect act of ritual, an act made more human by its doubts and gentle irony. Her mind drifted between hope and resignation, recognizing the gentle absurdity of believing that mere herbs and whispered words could ever control the unpredictable dance of birth. The ancient fears persisted quietly, woven into the fabric of daily life, reminding everyone that some anxieties are shared across ages, unspoken yet profoundly felt. Outside, the distant city kept its steady rhythm. Nothing had changed, and perhaps nothing needed to. In these moments of calm, the humbleness of human effort settled softly, like the gentle lull of nightfall, whispering that the fears of yesterday are often just echoes of today's quiet hope. As the evening shadows stretched across the low, woven walls of the hut, the labor quietly commenced. The mother lay wrapped in rough linen, her face calm yet lined with a faint trace of anticipation, while the faint sounds of rustling cloth and distant birds filled the air. Outside, the sky darkened slowly, blending soft orange into deepening blue, signaling the shift from day to night. The midwife, an older woman with gentle, tired eyes, moved silently, listening for the subtle signs that each small movement spoke of. It was, as many nights before this, a moment of fragile expectancy, ordinary, yet filled with the weight of new life beginning in simple silence. Then, unexpectedly, strange noises emerged, grunts, gurgles, and a faint crackling that seemed more theatrical than threatening. The mother's brow furrowed slightly as a sudden rise in temperature brushed over her like a warm, unwelcome blanket. Her cheeks glowed with a fever that came without warning, making her skin feel tight and her breath uneven. The atmosphere in the hut grew tense with unspoken fears. The midwife paused, unsure whether these signs pointed to natural progress or an ominous obstruction. In this moment, the quiet rhythm of childbirth was interrupted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face as she considered what remedy might yet be safe. Amid the flickering candlelight, a small debate quietly unfolded in the back of the mind between the old, forbidden incantations whispered to her by untrustworthy storytellers, and the new, risky surgical methods she'd overheard from a wandering physician with a crooked smile. The irony was thick. The very knowledge that might save or doom the child and mother was tucked away behind layers of cultural taboo. The midwife's fingers hesitated over the simple, sharp blade she carried, an unfamiliar tool learned in haste from someone who traveled from distant lands. The air hummed softly with the bitter humor of human resolve, pressed against ancient fears and modern risks. Eventually, the fever eased slowly, retreating like a stubborn tide beneath the calming persistence of cold cloths and quiet reassurance. The mother's breathing grew steadier as she sank into a state of quiet waiting once again. Her face, now softly illuminated by the flickering candle, appeared both tired and peaceful. Outside, the sounds shifted, less urgent, more settling, like the world itself agreed to pause, to give this small, human story its space. The midwife, relieved but cautious, resumed her careful monitoring, eyes half closed as if to ignore the small absurdities of her own uncertain craft. In this pause, life's persistent takes on danger and safety simply blended into the stable quiet of yet another ordinary night beginning to fade. Later, as dawn threatened the horizon with a faint glow, the night's tension dissolved into the stillness of morning routines. The mother, resting now, reflected silently on her ordeal, aware of the fragile dance between faith and knowledge, between old fears and cautious innovations. The walls of their humble home seemed to hold stories of countless nights like this, quiet battles fought with simple remedies, fears masked by routine. The midwife, eyes half-lidded with sleep, prepared for the next night, knowing that the cycle of shadows and light would continue, an unassuming testament to human perseverance and ongoing forgetfulness of past fears. It was, in a quiet way, a story of how humans simply carry on day by day, with a touch of irony sprinkled over their most human moments. On that quiet night, just after the birth, the chamber was filled with a mixture of relief and wary expectation. The child's cry cut softly through the air, cutting through the murmured prayers and the gentle rustle of linens. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Then a sudden, inexplicable chill swept over the room, making the oil lamps flicker and the shadows stretch. Eyes turned slowly, sensing an unseen presence that lurked in the corner, a shadow of old fears about spirits and curses that lingered in the minds of those present. The nervous gathering held its breath, waiting for some sign, real or imagined, that the night might hold more than just a fragile life beginning. Yet another fragile day. In the cold silence, a figure by the door tensed suddenly, lips trembling as if prepared to speak, but unsure if words could contain what lurked unseen. The legend of spirits that haunted new mothers seemed to breathe into the room, twisting under the flickering light, whispers of ancient curses curling around the edges of rational thought. Ninsun, the midwife, shifted her gaze toward the shadow and felt the weight of millennia of stories pressing down on her. Her hand brushed the edges of a small, worn amulet as she reached for her old medicine box, instinctively clutching the scalpel with one gloved finger, a tool of science and custom alike. The tension hung thick, a quiet battle between the fearsome unknown and the pale certainty of human knowledge. A faint, almost humorous irony emerged as some villagers whispered that the spirit's presence was an ancient curse, while others attributed it to the wind slipping through cracks or a child's fleeting dream. Meanwhile, Ninsun, with a calm but tired expression, began humming a low chant, a lullaby fused with old incantations, her hand poised over the child's tiny chest. Her eyes, obscured behind a shadowed veil, seemed to search for something beyond what the senses could grasp. The room felt colder still, yet somehow more mundane, a reminder that human fears often thrived in the spaces between evidence and imagination. The ghostly presence lingered, neither fully seen nor dismissed, leaving everyone to wonder if it was real or merely a trick of the mind. Time drifted softly onward, and the tension ebbed away as the night settled into a quiet, almost ordinary stillness. Ninsun finally lowered her hand, a gentle sigh escaping her lips as she looked at the sleeping infant wrapped in simple cloth. She looked at the shadow, now faint and hesitant, as if it too had grown bored of the game of unseen threats. The candle's warm glow cast gentle patterns on the wall, making the room feel like any other humble home, filled with the faint scent of herbs and linen. An unspoken understanding settled between the old fears and the slow march of reason, a reminder that the night's stories, no matter how ancient or absurd, were often just stories waiting for dawn. And in that quiet moment, everyone relaxed, if only a little, into the comfort of normalcy. As dawn approached, the whisper of the night's quiet chaos faded into the background, replaced by the soft sounds of newborn breaths and weary footsteps. The villagers would wake to stories of spirits blamed, then dismissed, as they always were, by the steady light of morning and the simple truth of things. Ninsun, wiping her hands on a rough cloth, reflected silently on the fragile boundary between belief and evidence. How easily the mind could conjure monsters from shadows and hope from the smallest cry. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if the fear itself was the real curse, lingering longer than any spirit ever could. With the first morning sunlight spilling through the door, she dressed the child in quiet certainty that, in the end, life was just another story, slow, imperfect, and endlessly human. As dawn softly seeped through the small, cracked window, the village stirred quietly, the air thick with a hesitant anticipation. Mothers, still weary from the long, uncertain night, sat wrapped in faded blankets, their faces pale, but tinged with a gentle relief. The faint sounds of children waking and the distant call of a lone bird seemed oddly subdued, as if the day itself hesitated before beginning. For generations, the first night after childbirth had been shrouded in fear, a time when old rites and superstitions held sway over the fledgling hope of new life. Yet on this morning, a faint shift was felt, perhaps a breath of change coming softly, almost unnoticed, like the first whisper of light over a peaceful horizon. That night's tension lingered in the air like a quiet hum, as villagers gathered in muted circles to discuss the strange, shared fears of childbirth, fears rooted in tales of misfortune and unseen spirits that haunted the newborns and their mothers. Older women, clutching worn cloth pouches filled with herbs and small stones, muttered old prayers that seemed both desperate and resigned. Meanwhile, a handful of local healers, with their scratched wooden bowls and faded robes, offered cautious remedies, blending long-held beliefs with fragile hints of new medical ideas. The sense of uncertainty was a delicate balance, each gesture weighed in silence, each voice a quiet hesitation to alter what had always been. In this stillness, human stubbornness and hope intertwined, creating a tapestry woven more with faith than fact. Irony settled gently into the scene, as some villagers began to question whether these old rites truly held the power they once claimed. Even as they clung to them like old friends, the healer's hands, rough with age and experience, half-heartedly performed familiar motions, while their eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity about things beyond superstition. perhaps a closed door suddenly nudged open by emerging ideas. As the sun rose higher, it revealed faces lined not just with fatigue, but with faint amusement at their own stubbornness, at the slow recognition that the world might be changing in subtle, untroubled ways. The old stories persisted, yes, but their grip seemed lighter now, almost playful, a whispered acknowledgement of human imperfection in the face of progress's gentle tide. By midday, the village's morning quiet had transitioned into a calm, measured patience. Mothers nursed infants wrapped in simple cloth, their faces soft and unhurried, perhaps a little amused at their own lingering anxiety. The healers, having observed the faint signs of recovery and resilience, exchanged knowing glances beneath their quietly shaded eyes, proof, perhaps, that healing was a slow, shared journey. Conversations drifted from superstitions to observations, from ancient practices to emerging ideas rooted in simple observation and kindness. The temperature in the room was neither cold nor warm, but filled with an easy acceptance, like the slow flicker of daylight that lingers just before dusk. Here was a calm rooted in the acknowledgement that human judgment, like life itself, was always a mixture of the known and the uncertain. Looking back, the village reflected on that first light as the moment when the old fears gently receded, replaced by a cautious optimism born of patience and understanding. Mothers, with tired but hopeful eyes, recovered in their own quiet way darker nights still there, but less daunting now. The village gradually recognized that blending the old rites with new medical insights did not diminish tradition, but allowed it to breathe more easily, like a quiet ancestor giving permission for change. Some faces remained blurred in memory, their expressions gentle and knowing, as time moved forward with soft, deliberate steps. In that slow, peaceful dawn, humanity's imperfect dance of faith and reason found a small, enduring rhythm, an unspoken acknowledgement that perhaps, at last, the first night could become less frightening. In the quiet hours of dawn, in the ancient kingdom of Aramith, Liara sat by the window, her fingers tracing the woven patterns of her linen veil. The air was thick with the soft hum of early morning chores as villagers moved slowly toward their routines. Her family's future was sealed with the promise of her marriage to Cadden, the warlord whose name resonated with power and expectation. It was a routine ritual, subtly binding her worth to a distant promise of security, an unwritten contract etched into every smile and hesitation. The walls around her felt both familiar and distant, as if history itself had paused, watching yet uninterested in individual stories. Later that day, the tense atmosphere subtly unfurled as the elders and the bridegroom's family gathered around a low wooden table, discussing the terms of the pact. Cadden's shadow loomed in their whispered conversations, his reputation resting on this single union. Leora, quietly present, listened to the exchanges about dowries and duties, her heart flickering with a mix of hope and quiet apprehension. Outside, children's laughter mingled with the wind, a faint reminder of carefree days slipping further into the past. This moment, seemingly mundane, carried the weight of collective expectation, her life measured in terms of honor and inheritance. The kind of subtle pressure that becomes invisible, yet relentless. As evening turned to night, the irony of the situation settled softly in her mind. How her future was so delicately woven into the fabric of others' needs. The elders, with their slow, measured speech, seemed unaware of how their words carved her role into history. One silent, yet unwavering. Leora's gaze settled on her trembling hands resting on her lap, and she wondered if this quiet agreement truly embodied her story, or if she was merely a token in someone else's grand design. Within the flickering candlelight, softly glowing in its low flame, a quiet laughter edged at the corners of her thoughts. How we arrange our futures with such calm certainty, only to find the edges fraying with time. The world moved on, unhurried, as if it too was weary of change. Night arrived with a gentle hush, and Leora found herself lying on the woven mat, eyes fixed on the shadowed ceiling. The promise of dawn seemed distant now, a soft echo of obligations that would soon unfold. Outside, the familiar sounds of night insects and distant voices seemed to hum a lullaby to the lingering questions in her mind. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the coolness of the linen against her skin, and to accept the quiet rhythm of her days. Her future, though sealed in expectation, rested quietly in her thoughts like a stone at the bottom of a still pond. The stillness was something she could almost hold in her hand, faint, fragile, but real. In the slow, unchangeable flow of her days, Leora's story became a quiet reflection on how time gently erodes the edges of certainty. The expectations laid upon her, like many before her, were part of a larger, ongoing narrative, one that brushed past her with weary familiarity. She understood that beneath the surface of these rituals, human imperfections persisted, woven into every gesture and word. As she closed her eyes, the soft hum of life around her reminded her that stories, even the most silent and well-worn, carried a quiet dignity, an understated testament that perhaps, beneath the layers of tradition, ordinary people simply wished to be seen. And in that enduring patience, there was a kind of silence that felt oddly peaceful, In the quiet hours of the evening, Leora sat beside her mother Selene in the dim glow of a small oil lamp, their hands gently arranged on embroidered cloths. The ritual was well practiced, a slow unfolding of modest robes and layered veils that felt more like a tradition of both matter and memory than active ceremony. Outside, the distant murmur of elders discussing modesty and chastity drifted faintly through the thick walls, their voices steady and unhurried. Leora's eyes flicked over the delicate fabric, feeling the weight of expectations wrapped within each fold. It was a quiet moment where history and family lined up like silent witnesses, shaping her into what was always meant to be seen calm, obedient, and contained. Over the next hours, Cadden's retainers arrived, their eyes subtle and observant as they circled the room like quiet shadows, testing her patience with small gestures, an insistent glance, a slow step forward, almost like invitations to stumble. The tension was woven into the space, a silent game of permission and restraint as they gauged her compliance through these minute pressures. Leora felt her pulse faintly quicken, her fingers gripping the edge of her sleeve to hide her unease. The room, once warm and soft, seemed to contract with a faint air of unease, underscored by the distant, muffled sounds of footsteps and whispered commands. Still, she remembered her mother's calm presence, a steady anchor guiding her through the subtle storm of expectations. There was a strange irony in how rituals of modesty were both carefully observed and quietly questioned, moments when the elders' voices, usually so firm in their tradition, seemed to blend into the background of Leora's cautious attentiveness. The veils and layered robes, meant to symbolize purity, now felt like silent shields that could both conceal and reveal her understanding of the world's quiet contradictions. The hesitant exchange of glances with Cadden's men carried an undercurrent of unspoken rules, testing whether she would surrender or hold her ground. A faint smile of irony touched her lips. How carefully woven was the fabric of obedience, stitched with threads of enforced politeness and subtle defiance. The rituals persisted, unaltered in their slow, methodical rhythm, cloaked in the soft humor of human routine. As the night wore on, the room finally settled into a gentle stillness. The air grew cooler, and the voices softened into mere whispers of history remembered. Leora's shoulders relaxed slightly, her hands resting quietly in her lap, as if the external pressures had momentarily melted into the calm of shared human ordinariness. Her mother's eyes, now obscured by a faint shadow, conveyed something unspoken, an acknowledgement of the enduring quiet balancing act that these rituals embodied. Outside, the night deepened, and the subtle hum of life, the creak of wooden beams, the faint rustle of fabric became a lullaby of tradition and patience, echoing softly in the shadows of their space. Calm settled like a gentle weight, reminding her that even the most intricate web of expectation was woven into the fabric of everyday life. In the peaceful quiet of reflection, Leora considered how these bygone rituals, with their silent rules and cautious exchanges, shaped not only her destiny, but the quiet continuity of generations. The veils of preparation, once perceived as barriers, now felt like a shared fabric of human persistence, threads of modesty, obedience, and quiet humor woven into the ongoing story of life's small, everyday acts. Her gaze drifted over the softly illuminated room, recognizing that beneath the layered garments and whispered commands lay a subtle, unspoken truth, that human resilience often resides in the calm acceptance of what is, with only a trace of irony lingering in the shadows of ritual. The night stretched onward, gentle and unassuming, inviting the slow passage of time and thought. On the eve of her wedding, Leora carefully opened an old chest in the dim corner of her chamber, her fingers tracing the rough cloth of a faded scroll. The air was thick with the scent of dust and lavender, quiet save for the faint rustle of paper and her uneven breath. As she unrolled it, she glimpsed faded ink, a list of past brides, each marked with short notes about their fates, silent, confined, or vanished. For a moment, she felt a strange warmth of historical continuity, the slow passing of unspoken stories from woman to woman over generations. In this quiet, she also sensed the weight of unseen eyes, the expectations seated deep within the stone walls around her, whispering of the sacrifices made in silence. Tension crept into her thoughts as Leora's eyes fixed on the records, and an uneasy knot formed in her stomach. Her heart beat softly against her ribs, almost impatiently, as a tiny voice wondered whether she too was destined for silence or confinement. The scrolls seemed to whisper warnings from the past, echoes of stories where brides vanished behind closed doors or were lost to the shadows. The faint rustling of her gown and the distant murmur of voices outside her chamber felt like gentle reminders of the invisible chains that still clung, unspoken but persistent. Somewhere, a cold truth settled quietly in her mind. Her choice might be limited, and the night's ritual carried an unspoken expectation of obedience. A small, ironic thought drifted through her mind as she realized how history had decorated this night with secrecy and whispered fears, as if the stories of those long gone were nothing but footnotes in her own quiet future. The worn scrolls, heavy with faded ink and secrets, seemed almost absurd in their silence. yet had shaped every bride's destiny with a firm hand. Her reflection was interrupted by the flickering of a single candle's flame, casting soft shadows that danced across her face. The face remained calm, almost amused at the irony of it all. The chamber was still. The weight of tradition settled like a gentle, unchanging hum beneath her skin. It was, in a way, comfortingly simple, history's quiet irony resting beneath the surface of her own fragile resolve. Eventually, Leora closed the scrolls slowly, her fingertips trembling just slightly, and leaned back onto the cool wooden bench. Her breathing slowed as she tried to find a peaceful rhythm amid her swirling thoughts about duty, history, and her quiet, unasserted hopes. The room grew darker as dusk settled outside, a tender calm replacing her initial tension. She allowed herself a moment to accept the quiet resilience of these traditions, not as chains, but as layers of human stories, imperfect and enduring. The echo of past brides' unspoken fates seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving her with a gentle, contemplative quiet about her own place in the long, slow tide of history. It was enough, perhaps, to rest quietly in the knowledge that some stories simply waited in patience, unhurried and quietly waiting to be known. As she finally settled into her cushions, Leora's gaze lingered on the darkness beyond the chamber's small window, her mind drifting toward reflection rather than rebellion. She thought about how history's silent expectations had shaped her existence, and yet, within that quiet, a faint flicker of her own conscious choice existed, subtle but real. The fragile line between tradition and personal will was woven into the fabric of each quiet night, unmarred by words or loud defiance. There was a calm in understanding these layers of human imperfection, a sleepy acknowledgement that the stories of women before her quietly persisted, both in shadow and in memory. Perhaps tomorrow she might find her own quiet voice, or perhaps she would simply rest in the serenity of it all, knowing that some histories are best understood softly, in stillness and slumber. Under the faint glow of oil lamps, the night of the wedding unfolded slowly in the quiet chamber. Cadnan, upright and quietly watchful, looked across the space at Leora, whose composed face remained partly shadowed, yet calm. The air was thick with the scent of pressed linens and faintly warmed honeyed bread, a lingering reminder of the day's rituals. As the moment settled into a stillness, Cadnan gently voiced the old expectations of surrender, of obedience, of unspoken bonds that had long shaped such nights. Leora's eyes lingered on the flickering light, and without direct protest, she positioned herself just slightly apart, forging her quiet, deliberate refusal within her own gentle dignity. A subtle tension entered the room as Cadden's words became more direct, the expectations subtly shifting from tradition to quiet demand. The air grew cooler, and the shadows stretched longer, almost hesitant to break the silence. Cadden's gaze lingered, not unkind, but insistent, as he sought the compliance embedded in their history. Leora's hands rested silently on her lap, fingertips slightly trembling, though her face remained still, a small defiance flickering in her eyes beneath the softened light. The moment felt suspended, neither retreating nor advancing, as their mutual perceptions of power, ancient, unspoken, and tangled, met with quiet irony. It was almost curious, the way the evening's seriousness gradually gave way to an unintended humor, a kind of gentle absurdity in human stubbornness. Cadden, mistaken perhaps in his confidence, believed tradition would guide her submission. But Leora's unwavering gaze subtly challenged that assumption. The room's silence was punctuated by the slow drip of wax in the candle holder, a tiny, endless reminder of time's slow flow. She, in her quiet refusal, seemed to weigh the long history of expectations against her own sense of agency. And somehow, the irony of it all softened the weight of the moment, transforming it into a quiet dance of human persistence versus rigid customs. Eventually, the night settled into a calm that felt almost like an old, familiar lullaby. The tension waned, leaving behind only the faint sounds of restless breathing and the distant hum of the evening outside the chamber walls. Cadden looked away, perhaps realizing that the expected power play had dissolved into a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of individual dignity. Leora closed her eyes briefly, her face softening, as if mentally retreating into her own quiet space. Though the expectations of power still lingered like a shadow, they now sat beneath a gentle veil of mutual understanding, an understated, enduring lesson etched into the slow rhythm of human interactions. As dawn edged in softly through the narrow window, the old court's chamber whispered of faint truths, the slow, imperfect human struggle with control, independence, and tradition. The night had passed with no decisive victory or defeat, only a muted reflection on how deeply entrenched patterns of power influence even the most intimate moments. Both Cadden and Leora, now quietly exhausted, seemed to accept that some stories do not need strong endings, only a pause, a moment to acknowledge the persistent, mundane human effort to hold to one's sense of self amid endless expectations. Such nights, the slow, unremarkable hours hidden in the folds of history, remind us that even in small defiance, there is quiet meaning, softly carried forward amidst the slow passage of time. Long ago, in a quiet kingdom, Bridal nights were ceremonies woven from tradition and expectation. The air often carried a faint scent of herbs and wool, as families watched with gentle, knowing eyes. Cadden, a young man with a rough-hewn face and restless hands, prepared himself for what he believed was his duty. The weight of centuries settled across his shoulders like a thick cloak. The chamber was dimly lit, and the silence was broken only by the soft rustle of linen and the tentative steps of the bride, Leora. It was a ritual that seemed timeless, yet underneath, the unspoken pressure to dominate lingered in the shadows, quietly awaiting its turn. As the night progressed, tension crept into the room, like a slow, sluggish tide pressing against old stones. Cadden's gaze flickered from his bride to the space beyond, feeling the unspoken demands tightening around their fragile connection. Leora's resolve, subtle but firm in her eyes, challenged the silent rule that her voice was secondary in these rites. There was a quiet struggle in their movements, a dance dictated by expectation rather than desire. Each step weighed down by the centuries-old script. The irony of the moment was that what was supposed to be a union was echoing the very power struggle it aimed to paper over, like a cracked veneer of civility. Then quiet humor found its place as Cadden, in a rare moment of introspection, looked at the blurred, shadowed face of tradition looming over them, an unseen figure shaped by many eyes and older stories, and realized the absurdity of it all. The rituals, once rigid and unchanging, seemed almost comical in their stiffness. Kneeling slightly, he gently brushed aside the heavy, dusty curtain of convention that obscured their better judgment. The room's temperature softened, the air cooled by a breathless understanding that maybe, just maybe, change was possible, even in such a conservative space. The irony was gentle, but undeniable. The night's power dynamic was quietly shifting, revealing cracks in its once impenetrable surface. Over time, the atmosphere settled into a calm, like a slow dawn breaking after a long, dark night. Cadden's face lost some of its stern resolve as he, perhaps unconsciously, offered Leora a tentative smile of acknowledgement. The temple of old norms seemed to lean away, as if tired of bearing the weight of unspoken commands. Their hands, resting on the roughened blanket, began to tremble slightly with a new, tentative understanding. The room, once filled with silent expectations, now hummed with a quiet possibility. A shared breath, a slight nod, marked the beginning of a shift, an unspoken promise that future bridal nights could be more about partnership than possession. Reflecting on that night many seasons later, the story seemed like a faint whisper of human imperfection, an ordinary event infused with subtle hope. The kingdom, over time, began to listen more carefully to its women and men, gradually realigning its norms toward fairness rather than dominance. The ritual, once a solemn affirmation of hierarchy, softened under the weight of everyday kindness and quiet conversation. It was a slow, unremarkable change, like the gentle unfolding of a story to which no one ever truly owned the ending. And yet, in this quiet evolution, there was a gentle victory. From the slow, unassuming night, a more balanced dawn was born. It was, after all, a history that neither roared nor shuddered, but simply shifted like the sleepy rhythm of a world learning to be kind. In the quiet village of Lyrath, the morning light seeped softly through parchment windows. As Alara prepared for her wedding, with a gentle mix of anticipation and calmness, the village elder, sitting on a worn wooden bench, recounted the old superstitions that had long since settled into these woven routines. Salt sprinkled at the doorway to ward off spirits, and a red thread tied around the bedpost to keep nightmares at bay. His voice, weathered and slow, told stories of wives past, faces blurred like shadows behind a curtain of age, who believed these small acts preserved their peace during the uncertain night. Alara listened, her fingers brushing the rough cloth of her gown, feeling strangely comforted by the familiar rituals. Outside, the air was still, touched by the faint scent of bread baking and the distant sound of children's voices, grounding her in a quiet moment of acceptance amid tradition's steady hum. As evening fell, the tension wove itself into the gentle hum of the village's evening routine, and Alara and Kaelin sat within their modest home, eyes glancing at the scattered charms and symbols, each representing a layer of old protection. The couple, curious yet uncertain, agreed to follow through with the elder's advice, placing the salt just inside the doorway and tying the red thread securely at the head of the bed, their fingers hesitating briefly over the delicate knots. The atmosphere thickened with a fragile sense of expectation, as if these small acts held the weight of future days, weaving safety from fragile hopes. Outside, a single wind stirred the curtains softly, whispering of unseen fears and fragile assurances, while the mirror, in accordance with custom, was turned away, hiding her reflection as if shielding her from her own gaze. It was unremarkable, perhaps, but the ritual somehow punctuated the quiet before the night, a pause in the slow passage of time. By midnight, the couple sat silently, aware of the small, ordinary objects that had been carefully arranged around them: the salt at the doorway, a red thread around the bedpost, and the turned-away mirror, all quietly suggesting they were part of a story they didn't fully understand, but felt obliged to follow. A small flicker of irony lingered, an ancient human joke that such delicate, mundane acts could hold the power to shape fate, or simply keep the night's shadows at bay. Their uneasy glances at each other carried the unspoken question: could mere superstition really perform its silent magic? Or was it just comfort layered over the unknown? The house settled into a stillness, with every creak and sigh swallowed by the weight of tradition and doubt. In this quiet moment, the boundaries between faith and skepticism blurred, providing a calm reassurance that the night was, after all, just another passage, simple and unchanged. As dawn approached, the small rituals remained undisturbed, salt scattered, the red thread still tight, and the mirror safely turned, lying in silent watchfulness. Alara awoke slowly, her eyes tracing the faint morning light filtering through the cracks in the wall, feeling a cautious sense of relief. The village outside carried on as it always did, unaware of the small dramas played out within houses like theirs, where superstition was woven into the fabric of daily life with gentle insistence. The humor, subtle and subdued, was that the night had passed, just another night. Yet that quiet victory was held close, almost sacred in its ordinariness. The superstitions, old as time, seemed less like protections, and more like gentle reminders of how humans cling to certainty amid uncertainty. Alara and Kaelin exchanged a brief, tired smile, beginning an ordinary day that felt somehow more significant for the quiet rituals that marked its start. Reflecting later in the soft glow of morning, Alara found herself quietly amused by the notion that a simple salt line and a red thread could somehow safeguard her dreams. Perhaps it was a story told over generations to make the unpredictable seem manageable, or a way to face the night with a faint human hope. As she looked at her husband, their faces blurred briefly in the warm light. She saw nothing but ordinary patience, fragile, imperfect, and comforting in its simplicity. The rituals, her mind realized softly, were less about actual protection and more about granting a pause, a moment for hearts to quiet and fears to rest. There was a shared human tendency to seek control even where there was none, stitched into the very act of rituals. And in this slow, sleepy sense of peace, she recognized the gentle irony. Humans embellishing the mundane with meaning, night after night, in quiet hope and quiet humor. On the eve of her wedding, Alara's mother, Mara, moved quietly around the small hearth, her hands deftly burning dried sage and scattering blessed herbs along the stones. The air was faintly fragrant with earth and smoke, and her quiet prayers brushed softly against the flickering candlelight, as if asking unseen forces to grant protection. Shadows danced softly on the walls, cast by the slow flicker of the flame, while Mara's face remained turned away, obscured in gentle obscurity. It was an ordinary act performed in a routine, almost routine manner, yet laced with a hope that the night might remain peaceful and free of unwanted spirits. Outside, the wind barely stirred, whispering through the quiet village, as if it too had little interest in disrupting the solemn ritual. Meanwhile, Kalen's brother Torin prepared for the night in a different, more material way. He slid a small amulet beneath the bride's mattress, its rough surface embossed with an ancient dragon sigil, an emblem he believed would ward off jealous spirits or lurking ghosts. His movements were slow, deliberate, aware of the weight of tradition. Yet there was a faint smile on his face, mildly amused at the idea that an iron charm could patrol the unseen borders of a single night. The room was cool, the sheets pressed flat, the air tinged with a faint scent of linen and oil. Somewhere, a distant dog barked, but inside, the household settled into a calm silence, punctuated only by the soft rustling of fabric and the faint humming that lingered in some dark corner of folk belief. As rumors spread among the guests of the White Lady, a vengeful phantom from local tailies who wandered the nights, the atmosphere took on an almost ironic weight. Whispers of her shimmering white gown and hollow eyes flickered between the windows, and the hushed conversations of the villagers, causing a subtle shift in the air. Some looked nervously toward shadowed corners, while others simply shrugged, silent in their skepticism. It seemed almost laughable, these small precautions against an invisible, restless ghost that might or might not exist. Light footsteps on creaking boards and the soft clink of charms became the hesitant soundtrack of the evening, an unspoken acknowledgement of human instinct to safeguard what is fragile, even if the threat is uncertain. Later, as the night pressed gently onward, the protective rituals settled into their quiet rhythm. Scented herbs exhaled their calm. The amulet lay beneath the mattress, and the hearth's fire dimmed but remained steady. The village outside moved in a gentle lullaby of shadows and subtle sounds, as if the world itself accepted the impermanence of security, trusting in small acts to hold back the unseeable. Alara, sleeping quietly in her bed, was unaware of these unseen guardians, just as she was unaware of the slightly bemused pride her family took in their simple rituals. The night was neither as threatening nor as worry-filled as some tailies suggested. It merely rolled on, an ordinary part of life's slow, measured passage. In this calm, human imperfection and hope intertwined quietly, almost comfortably, with the gentle hum of the universe. Looking back, it's clear that these modest customs, the smoldering sage, the tucked-in amulet are a small yet enduring testament to the human need to find reassurance amid uncertainty. Perhaps the White Lady, or whatever spirits, winter wind, or doubts they believed in, were never fully there. And yet, this gentle harmony of rituals built a silent bridge between the ordinary and the mysterious. The stories themselves, infused with irony and quiet humor, reveal a universal faith in small gestures to protect the fragile vessels of human hope. Such moments, small and seemingly insignificant, quietly remind us that tradition often exists less as a guarantee and more as an act of quiet persistence, holding back fear, if only for a night. As evening fell, the newlyweds prepared to cross the threshold of their modest home, aware of the old customs that accompanied such moments. They sprinkled a fine line of salt along the doorway, an ordinary act imbued with the hope of warding off misfortune, while the faint scent of dried herbs lingered nearby. A scarlet thread was tied around Kalen's wrist, a simple yet persistent symbol of protection, as Alara carefully positioned a polished obsidian stone at the foot of their shared bed. The air was still, thick with quiet anticipation, and their gentle movements made the small wooden home feel impossibly intimate. Yet, beneath the calm, a faint, unspeakable tension curled at the edges of their ritual, almost like the nervous breath before a long, slow exhale. Later, as darkness settled deeply into the room, a sudden gust of wind flickered the flames of the candles, threatening to extinguish the fragile glow. Shadows stretched and danced silently across the walls, and for a moment there was only the low, unpredictable hum of the house settling, a noise that seemed to carry unseen whispers. Alara's mind drifted to a forgotten chant, a lullaby she once heard to soothe restless spirits, though now the words felt distant, blurred by years of silence. Kalen's grip tightened on his sword, a half-hearted gesture of defense that seemed more symbolic than practical, the steel cooling under his hand. Outside, the house held its breath, perfectly still, as if waiting for the uncertainty to pass. Amid the quiet, an ironic breath of humor seeped into their serenity. The simple act of ritual had become almost absurd in its earnestness. The flame flickered again, and Kalen mumbled an old joke about spirits being afraid of garlic, something they both knew was pointless, yet still offered a faint smile. Alara, eyes half closed, considered the paradox of their efforts, that amid all their precautions, the universe might still be indifferent. The obsidian still sat unbothered at the foot of the bed, and the red thread kept its gentle hold. Sometimes, human rites seem both meaningful and futile, like a whispered prayer to a sun that has long since set in the sky of history. In the silence that followed, a quiet calm settled over them, a recognition that perhaps some fears simply drift away with the night. As dawn began to seep through a small crack in the shutter, the couple's breathing slowed, and the house was properly still again, as if nothing had happened. The salt was brushed aside, the red thread loosened, and the obsidian stone remained silent, unchanged, unshaken, much like the human rituals that persist despite their simplicity. Alara looked at Kaelin, whose hand finally relaxed from its protective grip, and she found a gentle humor in the small, fragile attempt to control the unknown. They shared a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that life's uncertainties would always whisper at the edges of everything. Perhaps, in that shared stillness, there was a kind of peace that required no elaborate protections, only quiet acceptance of the vague, lingering shadows. Their morning was slow, filled with the soft sounds of awakening. And as they moved through the familiar rituals of a new day, the old rites felt distant, yet oddly comforting, like echoes of stories told by a flickering fire long ago. The salt had been dusted away, the red thread tucked into a drawer, and the obsidian kept safe on a side table, out of view. Human beings are wanderers of the uncertain, anchoring themselves with simple acts, even if they know deep down that some fears are as fleeting as the shadows they mirror. In the calm that followed, the house held its quiet, every ordinary moment tinted with the gentle irony of human hope, fragile, imperfect, and quietly enduring. Perhaps, in the end, the most comforting protection was simply the slow, steady rhythm of everyday life continuing onward. As evening settled gently over the small village, the bride sat by a flickering candle, her hands nervously clutching a worn handkerchief. Outside, the moon's pale light spilled softly through the window, casting faint shadows that seemed to pause in quiet suspicion. Around her, simple charms and embroidered cloths lay spread on the table, a collection of well-worn tokens meant to fend off misfortune and unwanted spirits. Despite the ordinariness, a subtle sense of solemnity hovered in the air, as if tradition's quiet weight pressed upon her shoulders. Here, amid the gentle hum of the household, human worries about unseen forces mingled with the faint hope that the night might pass peacefully. As midnight approached, the atmosphere grew tinged with a strange, expectant silence. The air felt cooler, and the shadows stretched longer, reaching toward the silent figure at the window. Suddenly, the silhouette of the White Lady appeared, her form faint and ghostly against the moonlit glass, her eyes burning with an envy that seemed to seep into the very air. The charms placed earlier flickered in response, as if recognizing the threat, their soft glow pulsing with faint warmth. The bride and groom exchanged a glance, their quiet presence forming an unspoken barrier, a fragile unity in the face of what felt like a whisper of history's forgotten fears. The world outside felt suspended between reality and myth, as if the night itself whispered old stories of curses and protection. It was, perhaps, a moment rooted in irony. The very rituals meant to protect now seemed to stir the shadows rather than dispel them. The white lady's form flickered and swayed, her envy transforming into a silent parody of supplication, as if mockery crossed her spectral face. The obsidian stone placed on the windowsill pulsed with a deep, almost amused glow, perhaps sensing the absurdity of human attempts to hold the night at bay with mere objects and old words. The quiet hum of the house persisted, the only sound a faint lullaby sung by the bride, soft, uncertain, woven with early morning hopes, mildly humorless in its earnestness. The boundary between superstition and reality blurred, and the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment of transition. As dawn's earliest light seeped through the curtains, the oppressive tension melted into a calm, almost mundane peace. The white figure was gone, dissolved into the morning glow, its envy extinguished by the collective resolve of those present. The charms, now dull and unassuming, sat silent. The couple sat quietly, their hands linked, their faces touched with relief and a kind of shared fatigue. The unremarkable truth settled like dust. Superstitions endured because they provided a gentle, predictable rhythm to human fears, oddly comforting in their quiet persistence. Ordinary objects, ritual words, and a little hope had, in the end, simply kept the night's whisperings at bay, leaving behind little more than a faint sense of human resilience amid everyday routines. Reflecting on that quiet night, it becomes clear how fragile and understated human attempts at protection are little more than symbols woven into the tapestry of daily life. The white lady's fleeting apparition, the flickering charms, even the softly sung lullabies, each is a reminder of how humans craft meaning from uncertainty, while quietly accepting that some shadows will always linger at the edges of their beginnings and endings. Such stories, woven through generations, speak more of hope and shared fears than outright truth. In the gentle, sleepy silence of dawn, these rituals settle into the background of everyday existence, a whisper of history's subtle irony, humans in constant, peaceful negotiation with the unknown. As dawn stretched its faint light over the quiet village, the air seemed almost still, save for the gentle rustling of linen and the faint thrum of early footsteps. The elders, cloaked in simple robes, quietly recounted the ritual of the night, the embroidered talismans, the carefully woven red thread, reminders of ancient precautions that had, over generations, woven themselves into the fabric of their daily routine. The bride, nestled in her chamber, had slept under a protective netting, the air thick with the scent of herbs and old stories. It was a moment of gentle hope, softly rooted in tradition, yet perpetually tinged with a quiet awareness of human fragility. Somewhere in the shadows, a wall clock sighed, marking the slow passage of time, as history's old precautions silently persisted in the background. As the sun's rays crept higher, subtle tensions emerged, an occasional glance exchanged. A cautious touch of a hand, each movement quiet and measured, as if the very act of revealing the bride's safety could somehow invite misfortune. Tales of the White Lady's spectral presence lingered like a distant murmur. Yet the villagers clung to their rituals, tightening the crimson thread or whispering lullabies that echoed faintly through creaking wooden beams. The air grew warmer and heavier, punctuated by the clink of cups and the soft rustle of fabric, humble sounds of ordinary life that carried the weight of centuries. Even as doubts subtly flickered like shadows, the ritual sincerity seemed woven into every shared glance, every quiet breath, and every small act of reassurance. The story of ghosts and good luck persisted, softly clinging to hope's fragile threshold. In the midst of these delicate moments, an ironic silence fell. A sudden discovery of a slightly frayed thread or a misplaced charm prompted half-hearted chuckles or resigned sighs. The villagers, wearied yet unwavering, found humor in their own imperfections, slightly crooked stitchings, the faint smudge on a talisman, the unintentional slipping of a ribbon, reminding themselves that even the most sacred routines were haunted by human imperfection. The elders, their faces blurred in the dimly lit room, offered reassuring nods, though their tired eyes betrayed a faint amusement at the repetitive nature of tradition. The ritual, at its core, was no more than a collection of small, imperfect human moments, clumsy efforts at safeguarding love and life, played out beneath the persistent watch of unseen, blurred figures of prophecy. And yet they persisted, quietly laughing at their own earnest folly. As the morning settled in with its gentle warmth, a calmness infused the village's heartbeat. Alara and Kalin emerged from the chamber, their hands softly clasped, their faces painted with the faintest glimmers of relief and shared warmth. The red thread, now carefully preserved as a relic, hung silently in the village hall, a symbol of resilience more than superstition. The villagers, assembled nearby, exchanged contented glances and slow nods, their quiet smiles suggesting a collective acknowledgement that perhaps love's true safeguard was in the simple act of staying together. Despite all the ritual and lore, the White Lady's shadow seemed to have retreated, or perhaps simply faded into the background of everyday life. The village, in its unremarkable yet profound way, celebrated not just a marriage, but the quiet endurance of hope, stitched with human humor and patience. Later that day, as the village resumed its slow, familiar rhythm, the stories of the night became little more than a soft murmur, another chapter woven into the long, winding tapestry of village life. The rituals, once so solemn and urgent, now sat quietly among the daily chores. Women mending garments, men repairing tools, children listening, half engaged to old tales passed down with tired, amused voices. The protective tailies, with their blurred figures and fragile threads, felt distant in the calm but ever-present sense that life's uncertainties required only the gentle persistence of routine. Reflecting on the shared quiet of the morning, one realized that human resilience rested not in perfect traditions, but in the weary, enduring effort to believe just enough to keep going, day after quiet day.